Hello friends, and welcome back to this course titled as British Poetry. Friends, we are on Unit 9 and discussing William Wordsworth's poem Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. We have explored one aspect of this poem, and now we are going to look on the aspect of Romanticism in today's 30 minutes lecture. But before that, what will be the outcome of this lecture? You would be able to evaluate the impact of Romanticism on Wordsworth's poetry. So, this is a very important aspect, friends. What is Romanticism? What is the impact of Wordsworth's, let's say, poetry? How Romanticism has influenced Wordsworth's poetry? How, let's say, both are interconnected to each other? Can we say that if there was no French Revolution, there was no Wordsworth? Or if there was no French Revolution, there was no, let's say, Romanticism? How all these three things are connected to each other? We are going to look at all these things in detail in today's lecture. So, let us now begin discussion on Romanticism. Lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey represented a turning point in Wordsworth's career and in the development of English Romanticism. So, friends, when we look at, let's say, this course, this poem, we see that this poem is a benchmark in English Romanticism, a turning point into the career of William Wordsworth. The features we now most readily associate with Romantic poetry, the lyric focus on the personal thoughts and feelings of the poet, and the way the individual links with his or her natural surroundings were brought to new heights in this poem. So friends, when we talk about, let's say, personal thoughts and feelings of a poet, how, let's say, this lyric is focusing on the personality of William Wordsworth and the individual links of Wordsworth with the natural surroundings in which he is living. This connection is reached to new height in this poem, Lines Composed upon, let's say, in Tintern Abbey, few miles, lines composed few miles above Tintern Abbey. Here it is worth remembering the significance of the title of the collection, to which Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey was the last minute addition. Ballads are poems which tell a story and have some narrative interest, a quality which Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey notably lacks. Friends, when we look at this poem, we see that the significance of the collection of title in which this poem was compiled was a last minute addition. This poem was not earlier added, but at the last moment it was added. We see that this poem is written in a form of a ballad, but it is more closer to lyric. When we talk about the concept of ballad, ballad is a kind of a poem which tells the story, narrate something interesting, and these characteristics are lacking in Tintern Abbey. So we cannot call this poem fully written in a ballad style. Many of the other most famous poems like lyrical ballads, Wordsworth's own VR7, The Idiot Boy, Simon Lee, Anecdote for Fathers, these are all the titles of the poems written by William Wordsworth. Not to mention Coleridge's long narrative poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, are narratives, not meditative lyrics. So, the line is suggesting that it is little unusual to include this poem into the ballad collection of lyrical ballads. Ballads, as the title suggests, must include the ballads only. But when Wordsworth decided to include Tintern Abbey into this collection, it was a different kind of decision, because it is a kind of meditative lyric. Wordsworth is meditating on the lyricism, little bit different from the ballad style of writing. Lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey was the most notable longer poem in the collection, which took as its main focus not story but thought, feelings, memory and introspection. Friends, when we look at this poem, Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, we see that it is in a way, let's say, not very long poem, and its focus is not on thought, feeling, memory and introspection. So, these are the things which are focused upon in the poem, not the narration like a ballad. Of course, this is not to claim that Wordsworth invented the idea of meditative lyric. So, we can say that Wordsworth was little bit concerned to write a meditative lyric, meditative poem, which is why he emphasized too much on creating this poem. He was building on the work of earlier pre-romantic or perhaps proto-romantic poets who wrote about the countryside, such as James Thomson, author of the Seasons, and the most notably William Cowper. Friends, when we look at the structure of this poem, we see that it is somehow closer to the pre-romantic poets, Thomas Gray, James Thomson, William Cowper, etc. But Wordsworth brought out what was latent in Cowper and Thomson and gave it a new sense of importance and power. So, friends, when we look at this poem, Lines composed, we see that it is not exactly like the pre-romantic poetry of Cowper and Thomson, but it is trying to give a new sense, a new shape, a new importance, a new power to that pre-romantic poetry. Wordsworth wrote this poem in the Romantic age, but the meditative lyric characteristics which this poem has gives it the shape of a pre-romantic era, a modified version of the pre-romantic era. One of the chief differences between earlier 18th century nature poets and romantics like Wordsworth is that earlier poets, especially the Augustans, liked their nature to be orderly, hedgerow should be neat, lines should ideally be straight, and things should be brought under the control of men. Friends, when we look at, let's say, the earlier 18th century nature poetry and Romanticism, or maybe if we compare the Romantic poetry with the pre-Romantic poetry, we see that the earlier poets of Wordsworth, especially the Augustans or the poets of the Augustan age or the poets of the, let's say, age of Samuel Johnson, those people liked the nature to be orderly. Orderly means they created the portrait of nature which is very neat, tidy, beautiful. The hedgerows which they are portraying into their poetry, they should be neat, organized, clear. The lines which they are composing into pre-romantic poetry, they should ideally be straight, or maybe using iambic pentameter or following, let's say, traditional rules. And the things which they have created should be brought under the control of men. Friends, what all these things suggest about pre-romantic poetry? we can analyze that pre-romantic poetry focused on the control of men over nature, which Wordsworth never liked. Why men should have a control over nature? Nature is more powerful than men or than human beings. So, the poetry of Wordsworth is more closer to nature, and this poem, Lines Composed, is more closer to nature as compared to the poetry of Thomas Gray, James Thomson, William Cowper, or the other pre-romantic poets. One way in which lines written a few miles above Tenton Abbey might be regarded as a transitional poem between earlier nature poetry of the century and the Romantic movement, which Wordsworth was ushering in with his poem, is in the way nature in this poem hovers somewhere between order and chaos. It is not quite tamed, but nor is it completely wild either. Friends, when we look at this poem, Lines written a few miles above Tenton Abbey, we see that this poem is in a way transitional poem. The phase of transition is visible from the pre-romanticism to the romanticism. The earlier nature poetry of the century and the Romantic movement which came after 1798. And this poem is the initiative of William Wordsworth. It is very surprising because William Wordsworth is known as the name of the Romantic poetry, not the pre-Romantic poetry. The way he is dealing nature in this poem, it is, let's say, somewhere hovering between the order and the chaos. The order which is created by human beings and chaos which is created by nature. Nature loves chaos, human beings love order. Nature has its own course of action, human beings have their own course of action. But when we look at this poem, we see that it is somewhere between order and chaos. It is not quite tamed like a horse, but nor is it completely wild either. So we can say that just like a human being, let's say, taming a horse, controlling a horse, in the same way human beings used to control nature in the pre-Romantic age through their poetry. On the other hand, when we talk about the Romantic poetry, we see the wildness of nature. Nature as controlling human beings, not human beings controlling nature. The wildness which exists in Romanticism is somewhere, let's say, partially visible in this poem, Lines written a few miles above Tenton Abbey. So partially, this poem fulfills the requirements of the pre-Romantic and then the Romantic age. Wordsworth may imagine that the smoke billowing up from those cottages is from hermits living entirely separate from society in caves, in the hills and woods, but he knows that this is fancy rather than reality. Friends, when we talk about the poetry of William Wordsworth, we think that although he imagines, but he is a realistic also. He is a realist as well. The smoke billowing up from the cottages, from the hermits living entirely separate from the society in caves, hills and woods, it is not possible to live in the present world. Which is why, friends, you know that Wordsworth, along with his fellow men, few poets, built their huts, cottages adjacent to the river, and then they were considered as lake poets. But they did not go to jungle, they did not go to deep forests, because they know that they would be killed there. by the wild animals. They were witty people. They wanted to enjoy the nature, but without facing the problems and disadvantages which nature had. They knew that it would be very fancy to go into the deep forests to feel the nature. So they were realistic people. Wordsworth was a wise person. Similarly, those very plots of cottage ground, which sound orderly given the presence of the word plots, suggesting careful planning, lose themselves among the surrounding woods and copses. Friends, when we, let's say, talk about the lines from the poem where plots of cottage ground phrase is coming, the sound orderly given the presence of the word plot, suggesting that these plots are not, let's say, wildly built, but they are more organized. They suggest a careful kind of planning by Wordsworth. They are not, let's say, losing themselves among the surrounding woods and copses, but they are well organized plots. Friends, you might have seen this kind of structure in the present world also. You might wish to, let's say, feel the nature, and there is a 5-star hotel which is constructed between a forest having all the facilities, AC, swimming pool, etc. Indeed, even the hedgerows are hardly hedgerows. So, when Wordsworth says that he gives the reference of hedgerows, they are not, let's say, exactly hedgerows, literally hedgerows. And this is perhaps why Wordsworth connects with the landscape here. Just as mankind work, the ruined abbey can be viewed just a few miles away. So, the reminders of the real world of society, building and living, are scattered throughout the wild hills and woods of the countryside. So, when we look at, let's say, this poem throughout the wild hills and woods of the countryside, we feel that Wordsworth is a few miles away from Tenton Abbey, but he is not living in a deep forest. Still, there are things which are organized. He can see the buildings living scattered throughout those wild hills. So, that place is a mixture of control and wildness. This juxtaposition is what lends the place a particular significance for Wordsworth. Friends, we can call it a juxtaposition, mixture of urban life and rural life. In the last analysis, then, lines written a few miles above Tenton Abbey is a poem that shows Romanticism, emerging from earlier poetry, but also becoming something distinctive and distinct. So, friends, we can say that this poem in Romanticism is different from the earlier poetry written in the pre-Romantic age. It is something distinctive from that, let's say, poetry. This, we can say that William Wordsworth's Tenton Abbey is an ideal example of romantic poetry. So, we can say that this poem is a mixture of Romanticism and can be an ideal example of the romantic which Wordsworth need to share with everyone. As the web page, Wordsworth's Tenton Abbey notes this recollection was added to the end of his book Lyrical Ballads as a spontaneous poem that formed upon revisiting Wye Valley with his sister. Friends, we can say that when Wordsworth was creating this book Lyrical Ballads, he was compiling different ballads into it. At the end, he thought of adding this poem, Lines Composed. Why? Nobody knows. But maybe he thought that this poem was written in spontaneity by Wordsworth, so it need to be added in spontaneity at the end of the book. Maybe this revisit to Wye Valley was an spontaneous decision by William Wordsworth with his sister, which is why in spontaneity he added this poem to the book. Or God knows whatever the reasons were, but ultimately it was a very difficult kind of decision for Wordsworth to add this poem in the collection of ballads, because this poem is not exactly a ballad, but it is a lyric poetry. His writing style incorporated all of the romantic perceptions, such as nature, the ordinary, the individual, the imagination, the distance, which he used to his most creative extent to create distinctive recollection of nature and emotion, centered on striking descriptions of his individual reactions to these everyday ordinary things. And this is right, friends. These are ordinary things which we see in our everyday life. Individual, imagination, distance, or let's say the other things, emotion, etc. We all feel them in our day-to-day life, but we don't know how to channelize our thoughts and write a poetry on such unmemorable experiences. And Wordsworth was the one who was able to create this poetry, narrate this poetry, this individual reaction, looking into the ordinary things of life in this poem. I hope that you have now understood the spirit of Romanticism which is visible in this poem, lines composed a few miles above Tenton Abbey. That is all for today. Thank you for listening.